believe we get it wrong when it comes to values in education is we want people to adopt our values. We want them to say, here's what we care about. We want you to adopt this and believe that's what you care about. That is not how it works. That is not how values work. We need, instead of trying to get people to adopt, we need to connect our values. We need to build bridges from what matters most to us to what matters most to them. And when we build these bridges, we allow for incredible collaboration to happen because I can use my value to amplify yours.
How do you navigate change? It's a question we think about often, and one that today's world expects us to be comfortable with. The challenge, however, is where do you begin? And how do you develop the mindset and skill set to be successful? Welcome, everyone, to the Sprint to Success with Design Thinking podcast. I'm your host, Saba Kidwai. Join me each week as I share the stories and strategies from the world's leading researchers and practitioners about why they believe the answer lies in practicing design thinking. We've often heard that you should start with why, an idea popularized by Simon Sinek. Well, today's guest asks us to take a step back and rethink this idea and what we need to do before we can truly even begin to understand our why. I love when people challenge us to rethink ideas and people who are willing to say the hard but necessary things that we might not like to hear, but that we need to hear if we're truly going to reinvent our systems. I'm delighted today to introduce you to core values activist, former rock star, one of the country's top 10 speakers in motivation, and a self-professed coffee snob, Brant. He's helped to change what's possible for industry-leading organizations like Netflix, Verizon, Anthem, SunTrust, Microsoft, ESPN, Hilton, St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, and he's here with us today to share how he can change what's possible for you. He's joining me to challenge how we think about leadership and culture. Brant shares his own personal struggles that led him to this realization and why that motivated him to help others become more self-aware about their own values that drive who they are and what they do. I begin by asking Brant why he thinks starting with why is the wrong place to begin and what we should consider instead.
For me, it comes down to the fact that our why is a choice that we have to make. And so the question I always have is, well, what is the choice based on? And that leads us to the what. The non-negotiable values are literally what our why is born from. And it's the activation of those values that have to appear in a purpose that's in alignment with the things that we say matters most to us. So if we try to start with why before defining the what, the odds of your why containing any of your non-negotiable values are slim and none. So you have to start with what, activate those words so that they become something that you can hold yourself accountable to, because these are your non-negotiables. They're not something that's important. I think that that's what I love about what Eric said is I completely agree. And I think that the challenge is we know from the data that we've done over the last 6 months with the assessment that goes along with the book. We've had over 5,000 people take the assessment now. We know that this sort of presents people with 125 commonly held core values. And it says, if one of these really resonates with you, just go ahead and click it and say yes. So we know the average person selects at least 30 different values that they consider really important. And this is the beginning of the real challenge, is when there are 30 plus things, and that's the average. I mean, we've seen 40, 50, 100 words that people select. When you have that many things that are really important, it makes it incredibly difficult to separate the true non-negotiables from these really important distractions.
I cannot recommend Brant's book, Black Sheep, enough. It's a quick read, and you'll find yourself returning to it over and over as you engage in the different exercises. He's straightforward, to the point, and not afraid to tell it like it is. In the book, Brant shares, if you're like the rest of us, you got your why wrong. Because for your why to be accurate, you have to start with what? What are your non-negotiables, he asks. What are the core values at the very foundation of who you are? Those traits that no matter what someone says or how someone influences you, cannot be altered, dyed, or changed. I asked Brant, how do we begin the journey of identifying what our core black sheep values are?
There's a couple of different paths, and it just depends on how vulnerable you're willing to get. And so you can sort of take the Maslow route and you can say, I'm going to go back over the course of my life to what he would call peak experiences, right? And you will sort of dive into these peak experiences, both good and bad, because sometimes our values are born from really negative experiences. And it is a longer journey. It is a journey that can bring up some very powerful feelings and emotions. And so what we tried to do is we tried to say, let's find a way that we can have people dip their toe in the water and discover enough that they really want to take a deeper dive, right? And so the assessment helps you sort of identify what I call your flock of 5 black sheep values. And the idea is we know that out of those values that you say are your non-negotiables, only a few of them are actually true and real and provable. And we know that a few of them are aspirational sheep, as I like to call them. But the idea is if you can get our values exist in a hierarchy. And so if we can get to the top 2 or 3 that you feel really comfortable on, that you can give me a bunch of examples over the course of your life as to how they've manifested themselves, then we're pretty comfortable that those are indeed real. And when we have proof, you can stop trying to convince yourself to believe something, and you can just acknowledge the proof that exists.
I love how Brant differentiates between core versus aspirational values. This is one of the best exercises in self-awareness that I've come across. Not only does Brant have you go through the exercise of filtering down to your core flock of 5, but the exercise in understanding how those came to be to begin with, which, as he points out, come through both negative and positive experiences over the course of our lives. And it's really that reflective piece, the journey, the reflecting on the journey, that's often missing when we do this work, both as individuals and as organizations. Brant wanted to fill in this missing gap that he came to realize exists after he went through a very personal experience of his own. In the book, he shares that he wrote this book because I want you to believe there is hope. There's hope that things can change. There's hope that even the things that feel impossible can be overcome. I've witnessed that miracle, he says, and I want to share that miracle with you. I asked Brant to share what he witnessed and how he came to discover his flock of 5 core values.
My journey started back in 2012. My oldest son, Theo, at the time was 14 years old, and he was diagnosed with this incredibly rare blood cancer that required a bone marrow transplant for him to survive. And so that started this journey of 263 days living in the hospital with him battling. And we found ourselves at a crossroads during his treatment where they had 2 separate issues that were happening that were both threatening his life. And no matter which one the doctor decided to treat, the other they thought would certainly take his life. And so we found ourselves in the parents' lounge one evening with 4 or 5 doctors sitting in front of us. And they said, we're incredibly sorry, but there's nothing else we can do. And we don't think he's going to make it through the night. So you should probably go say your goodbyes and, call who you need to call. And so, when you're in a room full of experts, what do? You say, okay. And, I grabbed my wife's hand and we walked back to our son's room and grabbed his younger brother and, sat on the edge of his bed. And, you try to find words for that moment, which is incredibly difficult, as you can imagine. And, I ended up having to call my younger brother, who lives 1,500 miles away. He wasn't going to have time to make it before Theo passed. And so we said, if you're going to say goodbye, I'm sorry, but you have to do it over the phone. And so he did. And he was incredibly distraught, as you can imagine, and felt helpless. And so he decided that night the only thing he could do was to sit on his couch, film himself holding these poster boards that basically described what was happening. My nephew is dying. We have less than 24 hours. Here's what's happening. Here's what we've tried. If you have any ideas, please help us. And he uploaded that video to YouTube. I stayed on the edge of the bed all night with Theo, sort of waiting. And the next morning, my phone is ringing off the hook, and I'm trying to ignore it. I'm awful at being present, and so I didn't want to be distracted. So I just sort of put my phone aside. And after a couple of hours, my phone was hot from vibrating all morning, and so I finally grabbed it and I looked at it, and I had all these messages and texts from numbers and people that I don't know. What I hadn't realized by the time I picked up that phone, I did not know my brother had made a video and uploaded it to YouTube. But by the time I looked at my phone, it had already been seen 500,000 times. And I was getting these messages from people from all over the world, some of them doctors. And so one of the doctors was at MD Anderson in Houston. And I had a voice message from him, and he said, "Hey, I saw this video, and I happen to be one of the leading researchers in this fungus that's attacking your son. Would you mind if I talk to your doctor? There's a new treatment that I don't know he's aware of." And so we put them in touch with each other, and I got a call from Dr. Tim Johnson from Good Morning America, and he said, "I saw this video. If you get me a list of anyone your doctor wants to speak to, I'll try to make it happen in the next 24 hours." And so we made a list of a doctor at Dana-Farber in Boston, a clinical researcher at Cornell, and our doctor here from MD Anderson that had already gotten involved. And they came up with this crazy plan to try to save my son's life. And it worked. And so we went from say your goodbyes to a treatment plan that was effective enough that changed the course of his life forever. And I go back to that fairy tale ending, that you can't live in a pediatric oncology ward for a year and not see the atrocities of childhood cancer. But, I go back to that. And even though we had this incredible situation happen where they saved Theo's life, I went to bed every night for 4 or 5 years with one question rattling around my head, which was, I wonder if he thinks I gave up on him. In that moment where I sat on the edge of the bed, I let somebody else dictate what my future was. And they don't have that kind of power unless I give that to them. And so I had to sort of come to terms with the fact that I hadn't defined my non-negotiables in that moment. So I relied on my emotions. And my emotions were in this tornado during that moment. And it was an awful decision for me to say goodbye to my son, when if I would have defined these things that I know now, these non-negotiable black sheep values that I have are creativity, hope, impact, empathy, family, and authenticity. If that would have been defined, that conversation with him would have been completely different. And in full transparency, as we record this, my son's on a ventilator in the hospital. And yesterday, he crashed and had to be brought back. And I was able to have a do-over with my son. And I was able to have a conversation filled with hope and impact and empathy and family and authenticity and all those things that were missing from the first conversation. And I refused to say goodbye because those doctors don't control the outcome of my son. And I realize that now. And so the deliberate intention that went into the conversation that happened yesterday, my heart hurts, but I have to tell you that I'm able to go home and feel good about the conversation that I had, as opposed to what happened, almost 9 years ago to the day.
A few days after we recorded this episode, Theo passed away. Our thoughts and prayers are with Brant and his family. Brant's strength, vulnerability, and mission to share his experience with others is both courageous and contagious. It's an example of what it looks like when your core values truly are reflected in your work. In the case of Brant, his core values he shared were creativity, hope, impact, empathy, and family. And you see these reflected in his book and the work that he does. If you take a step back, you begin to realize there are many instances where other people's ideas, systems, and thoughts were making decisions for us. To break away from this, Brant says, you have to identify your own values to drive the outcomes it is that you want for your life. Brant was lucky to have had a second chance with his son, as he shares. Not everyone is that lucky, and I want to take a moment to thank Brant for how he took a personal tragedy and turned it into a gift to be shared with others, a book that touches the lives of so many, through which Theo's legacy and impact lives on each and every day. In my conversation with Brant, we discuss how these exercises should take place earlier in life. And I'm reminded of an article that I read a couple years ago from the Wall Street Journal, where they shared that less than 20% of high school students graduate feeling as if they have a purpose. This is a tragic statistic, and it's really a shame how much we neglect the needs of our young people in our schools today. I asked Brant to share how we can use our values to identify our purpose, specifically in the context of helping young people do this work so that they don't grow up having others shape and decide their decisions and outcomes.
I would push back on that Wall Street Journal article, and I would argue that 20% of students graduate with a belief, not with a purpose. There's a massive difference between those two things. I think we confuse them a lot and we interchange them a lot, but belief does not require proof. That's why it's belief. For purpose, we actually have to dig a little bit deeper. It's not about believing. It's about choosing something that's in alignment with these non-negotiable values. So for myself, knowing that creativity, hope, impact, empathy, family, authenticity, those are my non-negotiables. My purpose, the reason I get up every day, is to creatively impact others by authentically providing hope. So if it sounds familiar, it's because it's loaded with these black sheep values, right? They're in alignment with each other. So my values and my purpose are in alignment. And when those two things are in alignment, the how we choose to live it out, which I call your mission, right? Whatever that mission is, you become incredibly adaptable and resilient as long as there's alignment between your what and your why. But if we start with why without defining the what, there is not alignment, and it makes the how we try to live it out incredibly muddy and messy. And so the idea is we need to help people define those non-negotiables, separate things that are really important from non-negotiable. When I mean non-negotiable, I mean no. Meaning that if somebody asked you to do something that was in violation of it, the answer is no. And it's no without guilt. It's no without feeling bad, because it is simply a violation of one of the things that matter most to you. And you'd be surprised how many people can't get there. They allow the 50 things that are really important to them to swirl around them, but they never settle on the 5 that are simply non-negotiables. And when you do, you find that you simplify your life. For these students, and I've had these conversations recently, my alma mater, Florida Southern College, asked me to come back and do a session for the students who are just graduating, and how do they pursue a career these days that's going to be in alignment with their purpose. And so we had to talk about the importance of defining these values, because the job they say yes to has to give them the opportunity to honor those things, or they're never going to be happy. No matter how much money they get paid, no matter how many perks come with the job, they're never going to be happy. I've been stuck with those golden handcuffs of being paid gobs of money to do a job that I was really good at, but I hated. And so to understand that there's so much more to fulfillment than the material side of what we often attach to it, and basically say, look, you have to have a job that when you go in every day, you walk out feeling like You leaned into that purpose. You were able to activate those values. You were able to give meaningful contribution. And when people give meaningful contribution, they stay committed to the work at hand.
I really appreciate Brant's evidence-based approach to sharing our values and purpose. One of my favorite questions from the book is, what are the rules that come with the job of being you? It's your black sheep values, he says, that set forth the rules. And in doing so, they provide a structure that gives you the freedom to say yes to what you want and no to what you don't want. What I also appreciate is that he's not only rethinking terms like values, mission, purpose, and more, but he's also providing really actionable strategies for how we rethink these terms and apply them in our lives. In his book, Brant shares that your purpose isn't some mysterious entity hiding within you. Your purpose is a tool, he says, for engaging your core values, and you can choose to pick it up and use it every day. We can't do this, however, until we define and know what those values are. Brant's designed a brilliant assessment that you can find on his website to begin this work. So up until this point, Brant's discussed identifying our values, what he calls black sheep. He's talked about how we can identify our purpose. He's challenged our definitions of why, purpose, and values. And next, he's going to share how these play out each and every day through challenging how we think about another word, the word mission.
Well, I believe over the last couple of decades, we've really bastardized the word mission, and we've sort of allocated it to missionaries, right? To going to a foreign land and living in tents with no running water. And it's this mission trip that you take with your religious group or whatever it might be. And you go and you have this life-changing experience that lasts for 6 weeks. And then you forget that you even went on the trip because life happens, but to me, a mission is simply a self-imposed task. That's all it is. And we need to demystify that and start understanding that, our purpose and our values rarely change. Our values are pretty much etched in stone by the time we're in our early 20s. And so when people say that, our values change over the course of our lives, I would argue that they never really discovered what their values were in the first place, right? Or they're confusing mission for purpose. So our missions change, hundreds of times a day with every interaction that we have with someone. It's a new mission. It's a new chance to actually honor the things that matter most to you, to live out your purpose in whatever way you see fit. And so I often say, for recent retirees, we witness this happen a lot, right? They're super busy at work. They finally decide they're so busy. They just want to relax. They want to retire, and they retire. And all of a sudden they're busier after retiring than when they were working full time. My father was a high school English teacher for almost 35 years, the same school. And I can't take him to the grocery store without him having a 10-minute conversation with the kid bagging my groceries, because he fulfilled his purpose in one way for 35 years with a classroom full of students. And so it's totally expected that he would engage that person in that way, because that is how he has fed his sheep for decades. And so I always laugh about it, but it's given me a new lens to look through and have more patience when things we just don't understand, because we're not looking through that values lens. We're looking through a feelings or emotional lens. Really gives me the opportunity to appreciate the fact that he's just trying to honor those things that matter most. And I believe that's the goal for all of us in these missions that we assign ourselves. I get really specific in the book. So I say it's not just about having a mission. It's about pulling out your calendar and programming these things into your day, right? You have to look in it. And I saw today that I had this interview with Saba, and I can just look at that and allow it to be, or I can use deliberate intention. And I started to write. So I wrote down creativity, hope, and impact next to our talk today, because those are things that I need to speak into existence. I can't rely on an accident for them to have the perfect moment to show up. I can't cross my fingers and hope I get lucky that they come up in our conversation. No, I'm going to actually choose to speak these things into existence because I have the power to do that. And when I do it, it resonates with you because it's actually the very fabric of who I am. It's not a role that I'm trying to play. It's not a persona I'm trying to put forth. You are experiencing me at the most raw, vulnerable level that I can be with you. And I'm being really deliberate with my intention in doing so. And that allows me to change what's possible for both myself and those that I interact with.
Our purpose and our values rarely change, says Brant. What does change, though, is our mission and how we show up to live our values and our purpose. I mentioned this earlier, but what I continuously take away from this conversation is the intentionality with which Brant is disrupting our thinking about these ideas. His strategies go from thinking about this in the big picture down to the details, such as how your values can show up in your calendar invites. Over the past year, I actively sought out people and books that were going to challenge my thinking. I find that we often highlight ideas and make decisions without a criteria or without values, as Brant would say. We applaud things that aren't really that great, and it's rare that we ask people to rethink or explain why they made the choices and decisions that they did and how those align with their values. If we're being really honest, this is a really hard thing to do in the workplace, yet it's an incredibly necessary one. In the book, Brant says when we don't take the time to pause and reflect on our values, we're essentially winging it. While we use and hear that word often, I was fascinated by the history behind how the term came to be, and so I asked Brant to share that story with us and what authentic change truly means to him.
So let's start with winging it because I have a dear friend who has renamed it intuitive leadership, which I find incredibly entertaining. That is a nice wrapping of winging it. But the idea for me is, so the history of winging it, I found incredibly fascinating, right? So winging it comes from the theater. And at the turn of the century, there was all these playhouses being built, and there were more playhouses and roles than there were actors. And so actors were having to fill in for other people when they were sick or injured or whatever that might be. And so they didn't have time to learn the lines. So they would literally walk off stage with a script into the wings of the theater and memorize what they needed to say and walk right back on stage and say their lines. And that became known as winging it. And it was designed as an emergency way of having to perform. And here we are over 100 years later, and we've adopted it as a way of life. We're actually using it as a strategy. And it's crazy to me that that's where it's at. I don't believe that you can do anything on purpose without discovering what these non-negotiable values are. The best you can hope for is that you get lucky and you happen to cross one of them in your plans, as opposed to literally using them to develop the strategy that you want to move forward with. I think it's funny. I looked at this, and this is the conversation I was really excited to have about what does authentic change look like, especially with the education system being where it is, where the new rules sort of being placed with a new administration, and we so desperately want to focus things on an outcome. And I say this in the book, and I mean it with my whole heart. Unless your name is Gandalf or Glinda, you don't have that kind of power. You cannot control outcomes. The best you can hope for is to control the deliberate intention that goes into making those decisions. And so when that is the case, what does authentic change look like? And I was racking my brain to try to come up with a way to talk to you about what this was. And I've figured out what it is. I believe authentic change looks like Pittsburgh. Okay, so hear me out. Pittsburgh has adopted the name, the City of Bridges. Okay, there are 449 bridges in Pittsburgh proper that sort of allow them to cross the three rivers that sort of surround the city of Pittsburgh. The challenge, and where I believe we get it wrong when it comes to values in education, is we want people to adopt our values. We want them to say, here's what we care about. We want you to adopt this and believe, and that's what you care about. That is not how it works. That is not how values work. We need, instead of trying to get people to adopt, we need to connect our values. We need to build bridges from what matters most to us to what matters most to them. And when we build these bridges, we allow for incredible collaboration to happen, because I can use my value to amplify yours. I can give you unique contribution that is directly from the things that matter most to me, instead of some group think, yeah, that sounds good, in a meeting where we don't get innovation, we don't get best practice, we don't get those things because we're not seeing unique contribution. So when we understand that, this is something that I'm sure you don't know, because I just finished sort of all the research with these 5,000 people. The number one shared value among humans is connection. Connection, authenticity, and integrity are 1, 2, and 3, but connection is the far more than 50% greater than the next closest value is connection. And so when we think about that, when we think about how are we going to approach education in an innovative way that basically comes with new ideas that are going to be impactful in a way that can change what's possible from what we have already, it comes through connecting values with these bridges so that we can both contribute to what the answers are, instead of a one way, you need to adopt what I believe is most important.
I love that. It's not about getting others to adopt our values, said Brant. It's about connecting bridges between our values so that we can amplify each other. Not only is this my favorite definition of authentic change, it's also my favorite definition of how we now think about collaboration, and one that I'm going to use moving forward. In reflecting on what Brant is sharing, it's that we don't do this necessarily out of malice. We're enthusiastic about our values and our ideas. It's one of the reasons I share that cultures of innovation begin with a culture of empathy. If you listened into last week's episode, you'll remember how Dr. Lohenry emphasized the importance of listening as a leader, the importance of designing diverse teams so that diverse ideas are brought forth that challenge and extend your thinking. Brant shares the consequences of what arises when we don't create healthy spaces for people to connect and share and connect to one another's values in the way in which he describes through connecting and creating bridges.
If you think about all of these extremist groups that we have in the world, right, and even within our own country, whether it's right wing, left wing, political, if it's gangs, if it's, you name it, there are so many extremist groups, cults that are out there. I believe that the reason that they have become so popular is because of people's desperation for connection. And when they can't find connection in a healthy space, guess where they find it? They find it in an unhealthy space. And we're experiencing this on both sides. And so the reason that they do that is because they can't see a bridge. When there's no bridge to get to where you are, they go somewhere else. And so we have to connect these bridges if we want to have the conversations that are going to lead us to the answers that I believe we desperately need.
One of the things I love about the interviews I get to do is I get to ask the burning questions that are top of mind for me. It's after lots of research and lots of listening that I invite guests onto the show. After reading Brant's book and following him online, I knew he was going to be the perfect person to ask a question that I've been thinking about a lot lately. I asked Brant, in today's cancel culture environment that is so complex, especially as we see the breakdown of connectedness between groups, it's really frightening to confidently sometimes show up as your authentic self. I asked Brant, are individual values enough, Or do we need societal values as well to help us heal, move forward, and build those connected bridges that he talks about?
I believe it's a couple of things. One is there's a massive difference, in my opinion, from being intentional to acting with deliberate intention. And if we think of that as sort of the lens that we are going to look through, and then we add in, so that I just told you that the three biggest, most popular shared values among people are connection 1, authenticity 2, and integrity 3. So here's the both good and the bad. So those are really powerful values, right? So really some incredible ways for us to build bridges, but also incredibly subjective. What does authenticity mean to you? What does integrity mean to you? I can promise you, if we both wrote a description down, they're not going to be identical. They're going to be nuanced at best and really different at worst. And so when we know that that's the case, and we're trying to figure out how do we lead in this time of cancel culture, I go back to the farmer's story, right? So this whole concept of black sheep and this fact that a black sheep's wool cannot be dyed. So every black sheep in effect is 100% authentically original. So if we know that that's the case, and we know that that's why farmers don't actually value them like the rest of the flock, we have to look at where farmers do value them. And so when you look at that, you realize that black sheep have an indispensable role in a farmer's flock. Farmers keep one black sheep for every 100 white sheep in their care, and they keep them as a marker. So every morning, a sheep farmer wakes up. If they've got 500 sheep in their care, they look out over their flock. They look for 5 black sheep. It's the black sheep's ability to stand out from the 495 other sheep that look exactly the same that gets the farmer's first look. When you lead with what I believe are these black sheep values, these things that are unique to you, you stand out from the 495 other people that look exactly like you. They do the same thing you do. They might have the same job title. They might have the same goals and aspirations even as you do, but they're not you. You are one of a kind. And when you understand and accept that you are one of a kind, there is no competition for anything that is one of a kind. And so in that light, I look at it and say, if we can lead with the things that matter most to us, and they resonate in a way that's incredibly powerful, we attract people to us that recognize those values, right? They're never going to share all of the same values that we do. Even if they had them on paper, they're going to define them in a very different way than you would. And this is part of the reason that we have to prove that these things are indeed real and not just believe that they are what they are. But I believe that in this cancel culture, what we find is people not actually leading with the things that make them that unique original. They're leading with one of the 50 other things swirling around them, and they don't truly own that value. It is really important, but in the sort of tornado of decisions that happen when things like this are moving around us, we reach for the wrong things. And when you start reaching for the wrong things, even if you deem them to be important to you, they are not non-negotiable foundational principles that you live your life on, where you can simply stand on that and say, this is how it is, whether you like it or not. Because of that, we get this confusion, because people want to profess in their Instagram life that this is how I truly live, when indeed it's not. And indeed, they're not showing the things that really matter to them. I talk about this a lot in personal branding, right? If I know what your 5 non-negotiable black sheep values are, I should be able to see one or more of them in every piece of content that you create, period. And if I don't, it's not you. It's a reflection of what matters to someone else, and that's okay, but it's not you. Don't expect it to resonate like something that is authentic, original content is going to. And that is the hardest thing for people to do. So when you don't define what they are, you don't lead with those non-negotiable values. And it's why I think we find ourselves in this cancel culture, is because we're focusing on behavior and emotion, and we're not focusing on the non-negotiable values that honestly, most of us share one or more of.
I'm continuously reminded of the consequences that a one-size-fits-all education model has, where we standardize teaching and learning and don't create the time and space for people to discover who they are, what matters to them, and how to best communicate that. This really isn't something that should be happening in your 20s and 30s. This is something that should be happening when you're young, that evolves as you grow up. I love how Brant shares that we're living in a tornado of decisions. And at a time when leaders are balancing so many different decisions that often have come with very little guidance from state and federal levels of government, I asked Brant what advice he would share and what steps he would recommend that leaders take to move forward in doing this work.
I believe that these values sort of are the calming eye of those tornadoes that are around us, of all these decisions that we have to make. And when we don't have these things defined, the platform of which you are standing on gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and it's hard to stay balanced with all these things swirling around us. So I would say the very first thing that has to happen is educators have to define their non-negotiables. They need to do it themselves, because it's different for them than it's going to be for anybody else on the planet. So once they do that, once they have said, okay, here are my 5 non-negotiable values, then I can start to look at the goals of the school, the goals of the classroom, the goals of the superintendents, the goals of the universities, and we can start to really form and build these bridges with deliberate intention. What I teach in the organizations that I work with, if you told me that transparency was one of your organizational values, my first thing would be, the way that I have to look at transparency is through the lens of my black sheep values. So I need to go through creativity, hope, impact, empathy, family, authenticity. And I need to look at how I can use those values to amplify transparency for the organization. So I would go, how can I creatively use transparency to get my team more engaged? How can I use transparency to drive hope into the community that I work within, right? So I am literally building with deliberate intention. And this goes back to this conversation of being intentional versus acting with deliberate intention. Being intentional to me is setting a destination in your GPS. You're being intentional. This is where I want to end up. But acting with deliberate intention is knowing every turn you're going to make in order to get there. And what happens in the car when you set a destination and you decide you're going to veer off to get that, whatever it is, your Chick-fil-A #1 with cheese, right? You start to come off, but you don't program it into your GPS. What does your GPS do? It starts immediately saying, hey, hold on. You're not heading the direction that you wanted to go. You said you wanted to go here. Do you want us to reroute you? Do you need us to do something? They start to sort of check us against what we said was our destination. Well, what these values do is they serve that same purpose. They help us go, whoa. I know you set your destination out here as this is the goal you wanted to accomplish, but you are not headed in the direction that you said you wanted to go. So you need to sort of go back to the path that you had said, or you need to decide that this is something that doesn't actually matter to you as much as you say it does. And so when we define those things as educators, it really helps us define everything from our teaching style to how we present content, to how we engage with the students. When we know what matters most to us, we take away one of the variables from the equation of how do we keep our students happy? How do we get them totally ingrained in wanting to learn more? We take away the moving target of what matters most to us. So now all we have to do is help these kids discover what matters most to them. And when we do that, when we start to look for these things, we find these incredible ways to engage that are so powerful that they actually keep the students committed to the work. Because when you base your commitment on a non-negotiable, it is much more difficult for you to convince yourself otherwise. When you base it on one of the 50 things swirling around you, excuses are aplenty. And you can just grab the one that's swirling at that time and just go, not today. When we really try to get them to use these things, and they will manifest themselves pretty quickly if you're paying attention, we really give them the best opportunity, not just to stay engaged, but they actually start to discover those things that matter most to them and what's going to keep them in the journey long after they get out of school. They're going to bring it with them to their job. They're going to bring it with them to their relationships. They're going to bring it with them to the effect and the positivity that they can actually contribute to society, which is what we're desperately missing right now, in my opinion. And so it starts there. And if we can get them to earlier, we get them to do it. Man, if I would have figured this stuff out when I was 21 years old, I'd be a billionaire right now, and a happy billionaire at that. But because I decided I was going to be 47 by the time I was going to get my stuff together, it has taken me a lot longer. So it's why I've sort of dedicated my life to helping people discover these things as young as possible, knowing that by the time they're in their early 20s, the work is done. They know what's there. We just have to remove these important distractions from their life so that they can discover what those non-negotiables actually are.
As I hear Brant speak, I'm reminded of advice we share when we say, if I knew then what I know now, this is how I would do things. So I'm going to ask you, what are your non-negotiables? How do you communicate these? How do they show up in the decisions that you make? Do you know what the values of those who you work with are? How are you building those bridges between people, values, toward your shared goals? Brant presents us with a number of valuable questions that I encourage you to share at your next team meeting so that you can act with intention, as he says. His GPS analogy is absolutely brilliant, and the book is filled with examples like that, and also provides the context and strategies you need to do this work. We each have different takeaways when we read books, but I'm always really curious as to what the author would like people to ask them. So I asked Brant what he would like to share that I haven't yet asked.
I think we've really covered, you broke it down perfectly, because to me, it's sort of the thirds that the book is broken into, which is the what, why, and the how. And if you really break things down for yourself and know that the what and why are static for the most part outside of a catastrophic event, and the how is something that changes all the time, to me, even when you have a bad day, you still give yourself more opportunities to honor those things that matter most, knowing that it's a choice. It's a choice. When you don't have those things defined, you don't have to make a choice, which is where all of us love to live. I would much rather be able to just go with the flow and not hold myself accountable to anything. But the interesting thing, and I think that this is, I mentioned it in the book, but it's amazing to me that this is how it's played itself out. When you accept the job, as an educator, if you said, this school has offered me a position to teach, they give you a handbook that says, here's sort of the conduct that we expect from you. Here are the things that we expect from you accepting this position. And we just go, okay, yep, great. But when it comes to this idea of the rules of being you, we're completely oblivious. We don't even think about it for a half a second. If somebody came to us and said, how are you going to meet your goals for 2021? And we looked at our boss and said, I'm going to wing it. We could expect to pack up our box and probably leave, because that's never showing the strategy of how you're going to get there. But when it comes to your life, we're like, I'm going to wing it. I've survived. And we talked about this before we even started a little bit. How do we have this conversation with people who believe that they're not winging it? I always like to say this. It is, look at how successful you already are. That is amazing. knowing the fact that you have not used an ounce of deliberate intention to get there, which means your intuition is really strong. You have some semblance of the things that matter to you. But when you drill down to identify those exact 5 non-negotiables, think about how much more successful you could be, knowing that you can push aside the 35, 40 things that are important and only focus on these non-negotiables. That conversation for myself has always led to somebody going, I could be more successful than I already am. I'm down with that. That swagger kicks in a little bit and they're like, okay, I didn't think about it that way, because I'm not saying they did anything wrong. That's the hard part, is you only know what you know. And until you decide to really define what these things are in your life, it's just easy to live life without them. But when you this is the way that I describe it. If you and I were 10 feet from the edge of the Grand Canyon, I could grab you by your arm and we could walk arm in arm all the way to the edge. We could dangle our toes over the edge and we could look out and see this amazing wonder of the world for all that it is. Now, let's back up. We're going to go right back to the same scenario. We're still 10 feet away. I'm going to grab you by the arm, but now I'm going to blindfold you. My question is always, how many steps are you going to take before you stop? And at best, it's a few. So my question is, why do you stop? Why do you stop in that scenario?
Fear.
It is fear, but it's fear of what?
The unknown.
Yes, fear that you can't see the edge anymore. You don't know how far you can go. So you have to think of your life and work and what you put into it in that sort of scenario. When you can't see the edge, we always stay 10 feet back because it's safe and it's comfortable. But guess where all the greatest things in life live? Guess where innovation lives? Guess where best practice lives? It lives on the edge. And so until you define the edge, you're never going to approach it, ever. And so you have to define those edges in your life. That's what these values help you do. They define the edges so you can walk right up. You can even dangle your toe over it if you want to, as long as you don't lose your balance. But when we do that, we find ourselves engaged in our life at such a deeper level that what we think is possible gets blown out of the water. And that's my hope for everybody.
When we can't see the edge, we aren't sure how far we can go, says Brant. Innovation, though, he says, lives on the edge, and it's going to be our core values that help us take those extra steps, both with balance and in collaboration with others. One of Brant's core values is hope, and his optimism has been a resounding theme throughout this conversation. I can't recommend Brant enough as a speaker. And as you think about speakers for your team events and meetings, I encourage you to step outside of your industry. Build those bridges of connection with others as you define and strengthen the edge for both you and your team. I asked Brant to close with how we can learn more from him and what else he provides in helping people do the work of understanding the values both as individuals and as organizations.
So I make my living as a conference keynote speaker. So the best way to do that would be to go to brantmenswar.com. You can see sort of the subjects that I speak on and how they apply. I speak at a lot of association conferences and organizational conferences. And that's one way. We are working on several other ways. I did do some group coaching, and we're working on trying to figure out a way to do that with the amount of time I have available. But it is something that we are striving towards to figure out how to do that as well. But for right now, I also do a lot of consulting with organizations that want to learn how to create deeper engagement with their teams, right? How do we build those bridges? So we come in, we look at organizational values, we look at personal values, and we actually build bridges and we start to see how we can use that unique contribution to change what's possible for the organization. I think right now, over the last year, everybody's been asked to do more with less. And when you're in that scenario, the best way I know to do more with less is through unique contribution. And that's sort of what we focus on. And you can still reach me at the website for that as well.
That's fantastic. Brant, thank you so much during this especially difficult time for you, taking the time, the generosity with your time to come and have this conversation with me today.
Oh, thank you, Saba. I really appreciate it. This is a very fortuitous. We found each other in Clubhouse of all places. And I have been looking forward to this conversation. I've listened to all the podcasts. So as a fellow podcaster, thank you for the great work that you do. And I cannot wait for us to continue to see where this relationship goes.
It's your turn to join the conversation by sharing what you enjoyed or what questions you still have. In a world where time and attention are so valuable, thank you for choosing to listen and for being a part of our Sprint to Success with Design Thinking community.